Welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
What is it that makes something sacred? Did our remote ancestors know something we don't when it came to where and how to live? Can a place alter your state of consciousness?
Hello there, and welcome to the 295th edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. I'm Ben, and all those pretty weird questions came from my co-host and partner in the paranormal, my dad. So we're welcoming back an old friend tonight. But before we do, we have our weekly paranormal contest. So last week's question was, what Colorado hotel is considered one of the 10 most haunted places on Earth?
Well, that would be the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado, scene of the 1997 film The Shining, and a place where the ghost stories very much are encouraged by the management, in my opinion. The winner was Mike Page of Springfield, Massachusetts.
So this week's question is, a few months ago, what Swedish explorer claims that he found what could only be a crashed UFO at the bottom of the ocean between Finland and Sweden? So get that right and win an autographed copy of my dad's most popular book, Footsteps in the Attic.
And feel free to join the discussion this evening. Call us at 401-766-1240 or 800-449-1240 from anywhere in the United States. Our good friend, best-selling British-born author Freddy Silva returns to the show this evening to discuss his remarkable book, just re-released under the name Legacy of the Gods, The Origin of Sacred Sites and the Rebirth of Ancient Wisdom. Freddy is one of the world's leading researchers of ancient systems of knowledge and the interaction between temples and consciousness. He is also a best-selling author and filmmaker. He lectures internationally with keynote presentations at the International Science and Consciousness Conference, the International Society for the Study of Subtle Energies and Energy Medicine, in addition to appearances on the History Channel, Discovery Channel, the BBC, video documentaries, and radio shows like this one. He is described by the CEO of Universal Light Expo as, quote, perhaps the best metaphysical speaker in the world right now, unquote. Freddy currently resides not too far from us in the beautiful state of Maine. One of his prime websites is www.invisibletemple.com.
Freddy Silva, welcome back to Behind the Paranormal.
Hello, Paul. Good to be back.
Very good to have you. Ben's going to take us the beginning of our journey here.
Right. So what makes one place more sacred than any other?
Aha. This has been the big question in everybody's mind. I was looking at some very ancient myths about how the world was created. There was an interesting story about the Hopi creation myth, above others, where they actually talk about how there are places on Earth where the Earth itself sends streams of life force to the surface, and when that happens, the whole surface of the Earth becomes much more abundant with life. And they also state that there are some portions of the Earth that were much more beneficial than others with this life energy, and they call them the spots of the fawn. And at these spots of the fawn, apparently people can be transformed into gods, into bright stars, and eventually those became the landscape temples throughout North America. And then we eventually began to build temples with stones and mounds on top of them all around the world. And it made me wonder, was there something very special and unusual that made these normal places on the face of the Earth sacred? And there's been a lot of work done by science to actually validate this part. There was a book released not too long ago by a gentleman called John Burke, who unfortunately has passed away. And he was actually looking at it from a point of view of electromagnetism, and he came to the conclusion, after measuring many of the sacred sites throughout England and North America, that every one of them appears to be sited on hotspots called conductivity discontinuities. And it's basically spots on the face of the Earth where geomagnetic field interacts with the telluric currents that flow along the surface of the Earth. And when these things happen, there is a certain geomagnetic or electromagnetic anomaly which influences the human body. Now, you don't have to remember all of that because the Sioux natives actually called it by another name. They just referred to it as scan. Much easier to remember. So that's what differentiates the whole face of the Earth in these little hot spots, and that's where people have gone for thousands, tens of thousands of years to actually have shamanic experiences, heightened states of consciousness, and indeed be transformed into gods, into bright stars.
Wow. Go ahead, Ben.
That was a very good explanation.
No, we'll wait till you hear some of the next questions. Okay.
Yeah, I know.
I can go now.
Oh, no, we're not going to put you on the spot, but it's things we've
get off the
experienced.
show,
I wanted to hit you with just some of the things we've experienced in some of these places. But anyway, go ahead, Ben.
All right, so actually, you kind of already mentioned where these energies come from, but do you electromagnetics? I don't know if you feel like if we need to go into greater detail on that. So, well, I glanced through your book really quickly before we got to the show because I didn't know what we were doing today. So, I noticed that there's a lot about sacred geometry, and most everything is a triangle. So, what is the significance of that, or what is sacred geometry?
Well, sacred geometry basically is an extrapolation of our understanding of how the universe works. If you look at the measurement of the space between planets and their perfectly spherical orbits, that is when you take the two mean orbits and you create a perfect circle between planets. If you look at the space between them, they can actually be defined to an extraordinary degree of accuracy. I'm talking about 99.9%. By straight lines, which when they converge, they create these beautiful shapes, which we call sacred geometry. And that's where the term really came from. It was the measurement of the movements between the planets. But the same geometry is also found in nature all around us, and in fact, it's even found in the crystalline structure of human DNA. So there are 7 basic sacred geometric shapes that are to be found in sacred sites all around the world. And by this, I mean how the relationship of the elements of temples are all related one to another using an invisible geometric array. And when you go to these places, let's say the Great Pyramid as an example, you are actually picking up the energy of that building in its relationship to the geometry that underpins it. So if you look at the slope angle of the Great Pyramid in Egypt, for example, you'll find that it corresponds to the 7-pointed star, which is the shape most associated with the notes of the music scale. But the one thing that everybody was talking about in the early days of esoteric movements and Gnostic movements and paganism was the triangle, which eventually comes into our Christian vernacular as the Holy Trinity, as an expression of the perfection of how the universe is created. It's one of
3 is the perfect number. Yeah.
And what I found was that this shape, this perfect Trinity, whether it's a right-angled triangle or an isosceles triangle, appears to be related to the way that temples are spaced out around the world, which I found extraordinary, considering that most of these places began as sacred mountains. And at the time when I discovered this, I mean, it was one of those days, and you live in New England, you know how it works in the winter. Mm-hmm. The winters are very long.
If it works in the winter, yeah.
Yeah, it gives you time to think. And you start hearing voices in your head, kind of like Stephen King just up the road from me here.
Yeah.
Which explains a lot of his books. I was looking at the relationship. I suddenly had this vision of how ancient sacred sites were related to each other using the Holy Trinity or the triangle. And I began looking at stuff in India with their holy mountains and looking at how certain mountains were holy and related to each other by the same myth or by the same age, because you can't just make this stuff up as you go. There has to be a relationship in what you're looking for. And I found that only 3 of these mountains were linked to each other by the mystery of the god Shiva and his works here on earth. And of course, Shiva is the counterpart of the god Vishnu. And Vishnu is also mentioned in the Rig Veda as always taking 3 steps. And I always wondered, why is he always taking 3 steps? Why is his power always imprinted on the earth in 3 steps? Well, if you follow the logic of the 3 steps turning into a triangle, and you map this triangle to the holiest places in India, you have 3 of its most sacred mountains aligned exactly, and I mean exactly, at a right-angle triangle covering 1,650 miles. And when you're dealing with natural mountains, you've got to wonder, how on earth do they do this, and how do they measure that to such a degree? It's quite an extraordinary find.
Well, the whole triangle thing means a lot to us. It didn't mean much to me until recent years when I started working with something I'd never done in the distant past, which is working with shamans. And one of whom is sitting next to me right now. And let me just hit you with this. We have begun to discover triangles everywhere. Working with a paranormal case in Connecticut that began with the quote-unquote ghost thing seemed relatively interesting because the woman had read my 2002 book on which brings in the multiverse and all this stuff. The reevaluation of the whole ghost thing as relevant to that theory rather than spiritualism. And the more we looked at the case, the more it grew, the more depth it took on, and we ended up triangulating a whole area that was affected by this. And by, as you say, I mean, I can't think of a better explanation than what you said previously about concentrated areas of electromagnetic energy. This is what it really does seem to be. If you add
to that the fact that when you're looking at the triangle, which we take, it's like the five-pointed star, the pentagram. We take it so much for granted, and yet it's one of the most sacred things available on Earth. And you look at the history of the pentacle; it's very profound. It's even hardwired into human DNA as a crystalline structure. But if you actually think about it in terms of a three-dimensional shape, the triangle becomes the tetrahedron, and the tetrahedron is the building block of the entire atomic structure of the universe. So now you can see how and why these things do happen in triangles. There is something that's hardwired into all of us, and subconsciously, I think these things are not only happening on the landscape, but I think we pick up on it as well.
Well, we wanted to get into how they would know about all this, and this very elegant expression of the nature of the universe in these even just these shapes and these sacred architecture, etc. But as we triangulated this particular triangle, so to speak, one spot was essentially closed off, and there were reports of troops and all sorts of activity and secret activities going on, helicopters coming and going. At the other point of the triangle, as we mapped it, there was quite a, if you want to say, a mystical experience that took place there, right across the street from where some more activity of government or clandestine nature seems to be going on. What do you make of that? I mean, our remote ancestors would have built temples there, and we're doing government experiments. I mean, what?
Oh, it's not unusual. I mean, for example, we're dealing here with electromagnetism, and we're dealing with hotspots, and it's just like when I was researching the crop circle phenomenon back in England. The army were always the first people to be flying over the new crop circles at 5 a.m. And this comes from the farmers, which I interviewed, and they said, well, my dogs would be trying to chew their way through a door, my cats would be trying to fly through plate glass windows. There was something going on, and of course, since I now was able to prove that the crop circles are partly made by ultrasound, those animals are susceptible to that. So they began to pick up these signals. The farmer goes out with a shotgun thinking that he's got a burglar on his property, and he finds a black helicopter at 5 a.m, which you can see quite well at that time in the morning in England in summer, hovering over a brand new crop circle on his field. There's steam coming out of the crop circle, and the helicopter's bristling with high vision equipment. They're taking photographs, filming, and so they're able to pick up these electromagnetic hotspots on their radar. So it's not surprising that even here in America, they'll probably be looking at similar events. I mean, they'll look at paranormal events or anomalies.
Yes.
And just like we do, although they'll be looking at it from a different point of view, they go and investigate. So that wouldn't surprise me that they actually do that.
So wait. Did you just say that crop circles appeared over places that had high electromagnetism?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've been able to go back to these places 5 years after they appeared, and of course there's no physical vestige of the crop circle there. We can still go there with dowsing equipment and actually find and map the original design on the actual field. Those things are alive for years afterwards, and that's what makes them important.
You think what I'm thinking?
The shape is literally just the expression of the energy that creates it, which I was able to link to the forms of sound frequency. But there is an electromagnetic component, and there's no end of tourists that go to England, and they take their cameras and their video equipment, and they put them on the ground. They'll never work again. And I'm one of those people. I mean, I've got cameras.
Yeah.
The BBC has done interviews in crop circles the moment those cameras cross the perimeter of the design. And this only happens in the real ones, not the fake ones. Their equipment goes awry, and it'll never work again. So there is an electromagnetic fingerprint of these things, for sure.
I'm wondering if Ben's thinking what I'm thinking. Our guest last night on our CBS edition was Edwin Fuhr of the Langenberg UFO landings fame in Saskatchewan in 1974.
Okay.
And he was explaining that to this day on that property there are signs of the landing. The RCMP took
Well, he said it was
samples.
he said it was radiation.
It was radioactive, yeah.
Yeah.
And he said still you can see signs of the circular landing area that he, was a witness to and all this. And what you said certainly stirs up memories of our conversation with him last night.
And he also makes these plants sterile as well from those landing
That's what he
pads.
said, and nothing will grow there, yeah.
And that's what made people make the connection between that and crop circles, but it's not the same. You see, in the crop circles, the plants are actually stimulated to grow. So the electromagnetic frequency is not radioactive. It's actually a spectrum that is inducing the seeds to actually grow and grow much faster.
So it's a different spectrum.
And there's a relationship to sacred sites. They have exactly the same history of healings and altered state of awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, the crop circles are nothing more than an extension of a pyramid or Stonehenge or a Gothic cathedral, because the same exact things are happening at these places and have been doing so for thousands of years. And this is why people are also having shamanic experiences in the real crop circles too. So it's as if they're filling in a gap in our temple-making process, because we really haven't built temples per se since the Gothic cathedrals were being built in the 13th century.
And were many of them built on ancient pagan sites?
Absolutely, every single one of them.
And just from my seminary education, I know that much of that was deliberate to make it easier for pagans to become Christians, because usually they had no choice. But
there's part of that, and that is part of the trick. I mean, you always try to sort of imprint your own theology on someone else's culture by taking over their sacred sites, but there's much more to it than that.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the people who were doing it for benevolent reasons, and I could sit here naming, the Sabians of Haran, the Zoroastrians, the Cathars, people who really were pursuing, our what we would call Christianity in its true ideal, not to subvert people, but to get them to have a personal mystical experience of God for themselves, for the purpose of self-empowerment. They would add the sites to original places of veneration to maintain the tradition, not to subvert it. And the reason was to maintain the place alive, because as we know today, our prayers, for example, they emit electromagnetic fingerprints, and this was proved by Princeton University.
Mm-hmm.
And those prayers over time on a hot spot, which is already electromagnetic, it's only going to make the place remember and stay alive for years to come. So that's why we go back to these places, to maintain that connection and have these shamanic experiences.
Well, certainly we... yeah, go ahead, Ben.
All right. Well, let's take that a step farther back in time, from the time of Christianity. So, nobody really knows much about the Druids, but do you know anything about the part they played in any of this?
They are pretty much related to the Gnostic movement and the mystery schools. In fact, if you read the annals of Julius Caesar, he was totally frustrated and fascinated by them. He couldn't wait to get rid of them, but he also was totally trying to figure out what on earth were they doing. I mean, they knew about the movement of the stars, they knew about the planets, they knew about the manipulation of energy. There's a hint that they seem to have known something about the raising of stones with subtle forces. So they basically were just another, they were the Celtic group of the Gnostic mystery schools, just the same as they were practicing in Egypt thousands of years before. These people always, throughout Europe and the Middle East, they all communicated with each other. The secrets were handed down verbally. And just like in Egypt, where you take 20 years to go to school and learn the mysteries before you're even allowed near a pyramid, the same thing was true of the Druids. You had to go to at least 10 to 15 years of indoctrination into the mysteries before they even allowed you to do anything with subtle energy, because they realized the importance of this stuff, that when you start having this direct communication with a creative source, it can get to your head. Your ego does go through this process where you think, I am God and I can do whatever the hell I like. And I think that the difference with the Druids was that they were able to initially control that and teach people to harness it for the common good, so that you're able to achieve a certain level of self-determination. And when you have that, you don't start getting into the process of developing religions for the control of nations.
Mm-hmm.
You develop it for the common good of the people around you, and you elevate the people who you're with, and that's what leads to a transcendental sort of state of mind. In other words, I mean, they used to have a word for it. It was called the Great Perfection. The Tibetans used to call it that. We used to call it the Ascension in the Christian world, and the Druids just used to call it, being at one with the universe. So these things basically, these experiences end result, which is the total self-empowerment of yourself, so you could live life on Earth totally aware and awake and in total control of your faculties. Very dangerous if you're trying to be controlled.
Oh, yes. Speaking of the Druids, have you been, I'm sure you've been to Wistman's Wood on Dartmoor?
You know, every time I've passed it, I have never been able to find it, and there's probably a good reason for that, but I'm very aware of it.
Oh, okay. Well, actually, I did manage to find it, and it's ironically, it's right across the River Dart from a military firing range, which, talk about the presence of the military, but it's a very strange place. The oak trees are very ancient. They're not more than 10 to 15 feet tall, perhaps. And it's a place where traditionally, anyway, Druids hid from the Romans in ancient times when times were not quite as merry as they are today. And what happened, and I had an experience there that was quite remarkable, because the energies, as you might suspect, are absolutely overwhelming. And you walk in and talk about a change of consciousness, which is the next subject we wanted to talk about at such places. I happened to look up, and there was a half figure I could see from his waist up, all dressed in furs, and he was sort of looking off into the distance. And I couldn't see anything below his waist. And I said, okay. I took a few pictures, nothing came out. I was totally alone. No one else was there. It was a wonderful Moorish, I should say, a moorland March day, dreary, just my kind of weather. I tend to like austere weather. The atmosphere was perfect. And he turned very slow. It was almost a watery kind of a movement, and looked through me. He was perhaps 20 feet away. I didn't get the impression that he saw me, but I said, "What is this? Is this a druid?" I mean, Ben and I have mountains of ancestors who came from that area. Maybe was it an ancestor? I don't know. But this is the sort of thing that I suppose illustrates the altered state of consciousness that you're talking about at such places. I mean,
absolutely. I totally understand what you've experienced, because I've had the same thing happen to myself as well. And the funny thing is, if you go to these places, and you can do in North America, there's in Connecticut, there's a place called Gunjawamp where people have exactly the same experiences.
Oh, I know where that is, yeah.
It has a geomagnetic hotspot as well.
Mm-hmm.
These places really are alive. They are living organisms, and I think if you go there expecting to see something, you won't. I think you have to be of a certain humble state of mind.
I agree.
And of an
the H word.
Yeah. You approach it in humility, and also you ask. And I think if your resonance is of a certain, let's say you're a radio station, and your radio station happens to coincide with the frequency of each individual site, that site opens up to you, and it gives you back something that you are searching for. And these answers are very personal. Each vision is very personal. We are here on an individual journey of introspection, which leads us to have an experience of the creative source so that we can better ourselves. There's nothing else to do here but to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, the ego gets in the way, and attractive girls as well, but that's another story. But yes, it's to do with, in any other word, this strange enlightening experience is to have a shamanic moment where you are able to pierce the veil, so to speak, and in that moment you suddenly realize you're part of a much bigger picture, and that's what brings you closer to the concept of God in a non-religious capacity. It's to have that experience to realize you're not just a flesh and bone. There's something of you that's connected to a much bigger picture, and it's those little events where whether you see some of the history of the site or the guardians of the site or something is revealed to you, that's part of that experience. And in fact, the people who guard Stonehenge have some very interesting experiences. When I was living over there, I would go there in the evenings and have a little cup of tea, and would just sort of shoot the breeze. And they're very nice people. These are ex-Green Berets that used to go around deposing governments, and they're now retired, and they get themselves a nice night job to get away from their wives. And they say, it's funny. You'd think that we'd be here at night guarding a bunch of old rocks, and after the first apparition of a Roman army, it changes your life.
I would think so. Holy places. Well, we're going to take a short commercial break here, Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on WOON 1240 AM. and onworldwide.com. If you are watching on onworldwide.com, you probably can have the disconcerting experience of actually seeing us on your webcam, or our webcam. And here is the book we're talking about this evening, Freddy Silva, Legacy of the Gods, The Origin of Sacred Sites, and the Rebirth of Ancient Wisdom. And we will be right back to continue our conversation.
ON Radio, ON Worldwide.
Hi, I'm Margaret from Woonsocket. I listen to Memory Lane every Sunday, 1 to 4 on WOON 1240. Tune in to the Memory Lane Show. More music from the 50s and 60s.
ON Radio, ON Worldwide.
And I wanted to just mention that Amazon Kindle Fire, the new e-reader, and which also does apps, movies, the web, and more, has finally been released on the 15th of November, I believe, and it is now shipping. $199 for this marvelous device. Goes a step ahead of the regular Kindle, which in itself is a great device. You can get that for as low as $79. And, excuse me, you can read a number of books, up to 900,000 books, books, newspapers, and magazines, in addition to movies and apps and much more on your Kindle, or Kindle Fire, I should say. And I say check it out at Staples, and you can get, of course, 4 of my books, Faces at the Window, Footsteps in the Attic, Rhode Island, A Genial History, and my last one, published in 2006, the Turning Home, God, Ghosts, and Human Destiny. So check it out, Kindle Fire, Staples or Amazon.com. And let me also mention, I'm sure, Freddie, our guest, is Legacy of the Gods, I'm sure, is on Kindle, is it not?
I imagine it will be.
Okay, well, if it's not, we'll check it out. Legacy of the Gods by Freddy Silva, Silva. Very good. So we'll come back to our conversation now with Freddie. Ben, did you have any... I wanted to get into the change of consciousness at places like this. I'm thinking of also that herb farm in Connecticut where you were 7 years old.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was 7 years old.
We're not giving Freddie a chance to
wait, was I 7? No, I was older than that. I was like 8 or 9.
Well, anyway, Freddie, I probably never told you this before, but we got a call way back before I allowed Ben to do any of this, and it was an herb farm in Connecticut, and they had said not that they were having any issues paranormally, but that it was a very interesting place, and I might want to come and see it. Very innocuous kind of thing. In this location, they had built a lovely little tower over a spot that was one of great energy. You could feel the energy just sort of pounding out of the ground. I had been suffering from some internal bleeding. I stood in this spot just quietly. It disappeared. All right, so I essentially was healed. Ben came.
Wait, what?
With 2 of his friends.
You had internal bleeding?
Yeah, well, it's a long story. I'll tell you what. Where have you been? You were. Well,
I
you were
don't.
7.
I don't really remember. I was 8.
Don't worry, I'm not going to die just yet.
I was 8.
Oh, okay, 8. So anyway, just and you.
Sounds like a personal family conversation.
Yeah, sorry about that. That happens.
Yes.
They shock my son now and then. You were there too, and I have a photograph of you standing there and sort of enjoying sort of basking in the goodness of this energy. And I thought maybe there's a divine presence here. I tried to thank this, but it didn't want to be thanked. It just wanted to give, and that was a learning experience for me. Because I don't know, but is this what you're talking about when you're talking about altered states and interaction and good things happening in these sacred places?
Yeah, I mean, the veil between worlds is very thin at these places, and that's what our ancestors were trying to point out.
Yeah.
And when they'd learned that, they called these places the landscape temples.
This place had a statue that would move. They find it in different positions, sort of thing.
And they call these places sort of navels of the earth as well. And then eventually, by the time we get to the era of the Egyptians, we start building human-constructed temples on the same principles to recreate those effects. And if you actually dissect these places and look at the myths behind them and then apply science to it, you actually find that there is a good logic to what they were doing.
So has this been carried? Has this been carried over into more modern religious architecture? As we said, one does find churches in the middle of nowhere in the UK with, they're built in the midst of stone circles or with ancient earthworks.
Absolutely.
So there was an awareness of this.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
I mean, even when the church lost the plot, and they used it as a control issue. I mean, there were people within the church that knew and wanted to continue the old pagan tradition. I mean, pagan means nothing more than someone who lives in the countryside. That's all.
That's right. Yeah. Well, it's a Christian word, really.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so well, the point was that if you find some of these churches in the middle of nowhere, and there's one on Dartmoor, which we talked about earlier, called St. Michael's, and I actually take tour groups up there to ask them, why on earth would anybody build a church on top of a outcrop of rock that you have to slide down when it's raining and break your legs 5 miles from the nearest center of population? It makes no sense unless there's a reason why it should be there. Mm-hmm. And it goes back to what I was saying before about how all of these places occupy hotspots of magnetic and geomagnetic energy. And if you follow that through and you realize that the temples are there to benefit one thing mainly, and that is the human being, and you look at who you are, you find that, for example, most of the rocks that were carefully used in all the temples around the world have a very high degree of magnetite in them. This is why the chambers of the Great Pyramids, the rocks were brought from 400 miles away. So when you put yourself into that environment, you're in a certain sort of kind of an induction chamber, where not only the frequencies drop to a certain level, but also the magnetite that surrounds it is creating its own magnetic field. So if you look at the amount of iron that's found flowing through the blood of the human body, if you remember that wonderful example when you're at school and you take a piece of paper and you sprinkle some iron filings on the paper, and then you take a horseshoe magnet and you put it under the paper and you watch the iron filings follow the path of the magnet, that's essentially what's happening to you inside one of these places. Your body is being rearranged in a certain way. And you also have inside your skull, you have floating millions and millions of little particles of magnetite as well. So the site influences that state of awareness inside your head. So when you start seeing visions and altered states and things coming out of the woodwork and out of stones, you're not going mad. It's actually your brain is starting to adjust to its environment. And at that moment, you have pierced the veil. And then you better be careful what you ask for, because you might get it. It might be quite startling.
Yes. We had Dr. Michael Persinger on, the inventor of, among other things, the God helmet, as it was rather jocularly referred to. And, of course, he would use electrodes and this helmet as well to stimulate electrically certain areas of the brain, and people would have near-death experiences and religious experiences and things experiences such as many that you described. And the ultimate question to him was, does this mean that it's artificial, or the experience is legitimate, or both? I mean, are you artificially stimulating the opening of real doors? What say you on all that?
Oh, I think it's both. I think if you go in with a certain amount of ego, and this relates to anything really, I mean, if you want something to happen that badly, you will have an experience because you want it to happen, and you start creating this environment inside your head, but it's coming totally from you, which is why you always go back to the ancient texts and see how they approached the subject. And one of the things they did, again, before they allowed you anywhere near a sacred site, was to remove yourself from your ego.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And at that point, when you've actually removed yourself from the equation, you start putting yourself in a place of centeredness. And when you are centered, you are able to go in with grace into these places. Then you have a valid experience, you see. And the Cistercians, for example, under Bernard of Clairvaux, were very big on that. I mean, these are the people who actually were the brainchild behind the Knights Templar, the original Templars. And they always chose places which were out of the way. They were in some of the most decrepit parts of the earth. And they turned them into beautiful little paradises, because part of the idea was to put yourself into a hermetic environment where you basically stop communicating with the rest of the material world, which, back in the 12th century was extremely problematic. And also the desire to have material wealth was very, very big. So if you remove all of these very material possessions from temptation, or the devil, as it became known, you put yourself in a state of grace and a sense of state of oneness, and you are much more able to communicate with these hotspots and have a much more valid experience.
Well, that makes sense. So I suppose there is no such thing as the ultimate question. They keep getting deeper. One might ask, where did all this knowledge come from for our remote ancestors?
Now that's where, going back to the pyramids and to the Puranas of the Tamil culture of southern India, which is one of our oldest, shared sort of books, you could say, on ancient mythology, if you start looking at the origin of where all of these things came from, I can't remember the person who was doing the research on this, but they finally, just through simple logic of looking at the events in the Puranas, that they were able to link it to events of catastrophes throughout the last 10,000 years and quite categorically prove that these texts describing ancient cities of knowledge and the temples that resided in them in a time that goes back to at least 15,000 BC. And this is a very different time. This is a time before the big global flood inundated the Earth, and this has been accurately dated to 9,703 BC, according to the records up in the ice cap in Greenland. And just before this incredible catastrophe took place, they talk about these cities of knowledge that were built by people of extraordinary size and mind, and they compare these people to creator gods. And these people knew how to harness the forces of nature to bend to their will, and they were able to build these temples so that people could experience an otherworldly effect to let them know that they weren't just nuts and bones and physical bodies, but they're also spiritual people. So the concept of the temple goes back way, way beyond the time when we began to rebuild these things on the face of the earth, because after the flood, if you start reading the Egyptian texts, they pick up the story, and they talk about how in different parts of the world there were people who were told by the gods to build an ark and bring on board all different kinds of species, and inside this ark they were to take 7 sages. And this story is repeated again and again and again. It's not just a biblical story. It goes on throughout most of Asia by cultures who supposedly had no contact with each other. And these people, these 7 sages, were supposed to be the emblem of the entire knowledge of the temple culture. And after the arks grounded in different parts of the world, these 7 sages came out, and it was their charge to rebuild the former world of the gods. And part of the way that they were supposed to do this was to build these cities of knowledge that we today call temples at specific points on the face of the earth that would bring back the original mansions of the gods. And the idea was to bring back a state of paradise where people could go and experience the total perfection of how the universe exists. So the story is very, very old, but it's interesting that in talking about these people that survived the flood, these 7 sages, they were described as builder gods because they're the ones that built. And they were described in the Egyptian texts as the Ahau, or the Aku Shemsu Hor, also translated as the followers of Horus. And they are described on the walls of the Temple of Edfu in Egypt as standing 9 cubits tall. That's 15 feet in height. And you may wonder, were these people smoking something? But no, in fact, these people were supposedly traveled all the way across to the northern parts of Europe. They may have actually ended up in Britain. And we have, in Britain, thousands of giants' graves. In fact, you can go to any map in a store in England, get a map, and there you'll find giants' graves very clearly printed on these maps.
Yeah, I've seen some
right next to 2 of them. And they've unearthed bones there, and specifically during the Victorian era, they unearthed one skeleton, which wasn't just a skeleton. It still had the meat and the skin attached to it. And there was a photograph that was printed in Strand magazine in 1898, which I have a copy of, and it's actually in the book, of a 15-foot tall giant taken from a giant's grave, still with the meat attached to the bone. So these things obviously were real. These people were real, and they were always interred in these things, in these enormous mounds throughout the north of Europe.
You don't hear that in history class. Right, so when it comes to sacred sites, are there differences in belief and practice, or is it pretty much the same thing globally?
Oh, I think fundamentally it's the same thing. It's just how different cultures approach it. And but I think the one thing that seems to unite them all is a state of reverence and a state of grace, to a state where you put yourself into a non-dualistic environment. In other words, you remove your ego from the equation. There's also a little bit of fasting involved, because the idea was to make your physical body as light as possible, to have this experience with a much finer level of frequency.
And we're always trying to explain that to people. Yeah.
Exactly. And in fact, in Egypt, it's actually quite good whenever I take groups there. And I'm a big meat eater anyway, but whenever I go there, I have no problem just taking a big bottle of water and just eating dried apricots all day long. I can survive on that very easily. And you'd be amazed at the difference that it does to you when you walk into these places feeling much lighter. It does make a huge difference. There's also, of course, the idea of sound. And you look at the Egyptian text and how they revere the temple by actually approaching it first thing in the morning when they claimed that the temple came back to life. And they approached each part of the temple and they addressed it like an animate being who was awoken from sleep. So they described the temple as an organism, not as a bunch of rocks, but as an organism. And I was able to find a reference to this in some scientific texts and tests that were found in Northern Europe back in the 70s, where people actually took magnetometers to these stone circles, and they did find that the local environment, the electrical environment, and the magnetic environment around the temples of Europe, it does die away at night. And suddenly, just before dawn, the readings go right back up, sometimes at twice the amount of the frequency of the surrounding land. And they've shoved these energies at twice the rate through the entrance of the sites. And it's true. They did find that these places, these stone circles, these henge monuments, pyramids, they do suddenly revitalize themselves at the crack of dawn.
Wow.
Exactly the same time when all the fertility of plants also is at its highest frequency to receive the light of the newborn sun. So there is this practice that, to honor the veneration of the rising sun throughout the world as well. So for all of you who don't like getting up early in the morning, that's bad news. But because the frequency, that's sort of descending as the day gets longer and longer. So, but those are pretty much the same things that happen throughout the same time. You have to sort of look at it from the point of view that doing drugs when you go to these places, like doing ayahuasca, is really not conducive to experiencing, the full blast of energy at these temples. It actually gets in the way.
Oh yeah, no. We always, whenever we talk about that, we always stress we never encourage that sort of thing.
No,
Dan and I, we don't need
thing.
any stimulation of that kind.
No.
Yeah.
But
the ritual use of these hallucinogens is in actual part as a how should I say it? If you're doing it correctly with the right intent, and it has been done for thousands of years, it really is supposed to be a second best experience of going to a temple. So if you can't go to a temple, that's what you would do to have a similar shamanic experience. But if you have ready access to these places, and there's lots in America. I mean, they're all over the place, especially in the Appalachia, and also in Ohio. We have thousands of mounds. You don't really need that kind of stuff. You could just have the temple be your own drug.
That works. All right, so what about sacred places that have been destroyed by explosions or gunfire or whatever during wars or whatever? Let's say, trying to think of a good example. Was it Pakistan? There was the Buddha statue that was carved into the mountain.
Afghanistan. The Taliban destroyed it.
Yeah, how would,
the horror of the rest of the world.
Using that as an example, how would this site react to something like that?
Not favorably.
No.
Yeah, I didn't think so. It's a good question.
It takes the Egyptians were very clear about the idea of what made the sacred space, and you could just it was one thing to move the energy around and put it some way where you needed it. They actually described it as harnessing the enemy snake, which basically is a metaphor for moving the Earth's telluric lines of energy, which anyone can actually teach anyone how to do this. It's actually quite simple, kind of like driving a car. It does give you one hell of a headache, though. And these places then were, these enemy snakes were then harnessed. They were anchored to the spot by the type of stone that they used, and then the energy of the snake became conducive to a certain point of view. And that itself wasn't enough. You didn't have to build a temple according to a certain geometric protocol, to a certain use of sacred measure. Not all measures are the same. And then, over time, as the temples are built and rebuilt on top of each other, and thousands of people go there to venerate it, their energy is added to the site as well, and the site and the stones remember. Because remember, the stones themselves have a lot of quartz. Quartz is piezoelectric. It is susceptible also to thought and emotion. And one of the things that you did before you walked into the temple was to leave all your negative thoughts outside. Because if you took your negative emotions into the temple, you pollute the mansion of the gods, and you bring down not just yourself, but the entire tribe.
Mm-hmm.
And they were very serious about this.
Yeah, it's very true.
So it was the build-up over time which created this sense of energy. So if, let's take, for example, England, and around the proving grounds in the middle of England, which is called Salisbury Plain, oddly enough, there are some of the best preserved sacred sites because they tend to not shoot at these things. And you go to some of these mounds, and they're pretty much active. But the ones that have been accidentally sort of devoured by the local farmers to increase the size of land that they want to yield their crops, you do find that depending on who's gone back there to revitalize the concept of sacred space, the site may be have gone, but the energy is still there. It's just like I was saying before with the crop circles. You know, the physical shape is gone, but the energy is still there. So if people go and maintain the tradition of the sacred space, they are literally using their intent to keep the energy going. The physical site doesn't really matter anymore. The fact is that the memory of the site remains. But if they let it go and these places are forgotten, then obviously just like a flower that doesn't get watered, they eventually just die, and you forget about them. So it really depends on the people who are looking after them after the physical remains have been disturbed.
Yeah, I have noticed that some people in England would say, well, I visited, for example, the Scorehill Stone Circle in Devon, and that seemed to be very active. Others were not. But before we run out of time here, I have one question that I wanted to ask and not neglect to ask this time. There are a number of astronomers who will, when you ask them this, put down their coffee and look at you strangely, but answer honestly, and they'll say that a number of very odd electromagnetic phenomena are going on in the galactic neighborhood right now. Much has been made of the 2012 thing, and that the galactic neighborhood is flattening out, the system is flattening out, all this business, and that this is creating all sorts of electromagnetic anomalies. Have you, as a researcher in this subject, noticed anything changing or odd or more active or less active that might possibly be connected with these changes in the neighborhood, so to speak?
Well, answering from the point of view of sacred space, and also and I'm putting the crop circles into that, I have found over the last 20 years, and I'm going to just back this up, what I found during my research into the book was that our building of sacred spaces as a race seems to congregate in certain clumps around history, and they always precede major catastrophes. It's as if suddenly we just down all our tools and go on a big binge of creating temples, no matter what they look like. And the last time we built one en masse was in Northern Europe with the Gothic cathedrals in the 12th century. That preceded, just barely, a mini ice age, which only concluded in the 18th century,
That's right.
Early 19th century. And since then, nothing has happened. And the crop circles are filling in that gap because they are built exactly of the same principles as any temple in the world. And they are having the same effect. And they're also appearing on the same magnetic lines of energy of the Earth. And we are also now approaching a change in climate, rising sea levels, changes in the sunspot cycle. And what I've witnessed is that more and more people are going back to the sacred sites. And they may not really know consciously why, but I think these places are coming alive. And because we are susceptible to that energy, I think we are going back to the core of these places, these spots of the fawn, and trying to pick up our connection to the environment. Because when it comes down to it, that's what it's all about. Our survival is really literally down to our connection to the universe, nature. And we've forgotten that. And by being more attuned to it, I know it sounds corny, but it's absolutely
It sounds
true.
like a very, very good thing.
Yeah, by being more attuned to it, we actually are able to be much more prepared for the changes. And the changes are here. The changes have been happening and with us for hundreds of years, and they will continue for hundreds of years. 2012 is just a window. But I do believe that these temples were built as an insurance policy for us to remember what we'd forgotten, because they realized that we would forget our connection. And by watching people going much more to these places, taking much more of an active involvement in these sites, I think that we are part of that awakening, and that we are beginning to feel that shift is upon us. I personally don't think anything's going to happen at the end of 2012 unless a mass amount of people on Earth suddenly make it happen.
Yeah.
And of course, we have the power to do that as well. It would be a shame. I would hate to sort of come all the way this far to incarnate in this lifetime and just watch it all go down because a bunch of people suddenly panics and they start believing the hype.
Well,
I think we'll still be here.
There are always alternatives.
Exactly.
As Mr. Spock would say. Yeah. Let me ask you this, and we do have a few more minutes. Freddie, what experiences, can you give us an example of an experience you have had at such places?
Oh, God, yeah, many. And again, I should point out to people who are listening that I don't go to these places experiencing something to happen. I was actually raised as a Catholic and became an atheist for obvious reasons. And then discovered through going to these sites something far greater than myself that has basically made me much more spiritual yet again, but without a religious point of view.
Right.
And so I don't go to these places expecting something to happen. And when they do happen, I could mention some expletives. There's one case, one famous thing that happened when I was in the pyramid in Egypt, the Great Pyramid. And I was there with 3 other people. And anybody that's been there knows that the only way to get the place to yourself is to pay a lot of backsheesh to the people that run these places. And we were there in the middle of the day. The place was packed with people, kids running up and down the Great Gallery, making a hell of a racket. And suddenly everybody vanished, leaving 4 of us inside the King's Chamber. The lights went off, and we had the place to ourselves in total darkness for 20 minutes. That does not happen by accident. And one of the men that was with me said that I belong to a part of a group that does work at sacred sites very quietly. And they asked me to do a little bit of toning at the site to honor the site. And I said, I can do that. And I found myself coming up with notes that I've never been able to do then or since,
Wow.
as did the other 3 men. And as we did this vocal exercise, in total darkness, I saw, with 3 people as my witness, I saw a group of about 30 people, about 9 feet tall, coming out of the stones of the chamber, surrounding us in these beautiful white sort of silk robes, beautiful things. I'm in total darkness, and I can see these people to the point I could draw them.
How tall were
Anyway,
they?
they're about 9 feet tall. And
Really?
afterwards, 20 minutes later, the lights went on, and we looked shocked. And I could see that these people wanted to say something, and we quietly made our way out of the pyramid. There was a very angry Arab at the bottom who realized that something had happened that should have been happening, and he was blaming us for it. And once outside, I looked at one of the guys, and it was obvious that we had something to say to each other. And I said, "Did you see what I saw?" And he just said, "You mean all of those people that came out of the rocks and surrounded us in a big circle dressed in white? You saw that as well?" I said, "Absolutely. What was that all about?" Now, you can't make that up.
Did you see their faces?
No, they didn't show their faces. They had these beautiful sort of hoods over them. It was the most incredible feeling of total unconditional love. It really was the most profound experience.
I think we know that species. Okay. All right.
And the funny thing is, when I began to, and I had a sense that I received this information, and the information eventually became the book that we're talking about this evening. That stuff just came pouring out of me. So that was the intent that I went in there with. I wanted to help to understand how these places work so I could teach it.
Okay.
And I think that experience is related to that.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time, Freddie. It's been absolutely fascinating. Could you tell us about the book and the website just very quickly?
Yes, you can go to it at www.invisibletemple.com. It's called Legacy of the Gods, although it has a slightly different title on my site, and it will be explained why. And there's all kinds of special offers there as well, and videos and all kinds of things, and tons of information. You'll never leave.
Excellent. It's been wonderful to have you back again. We're going to have you back again soon because there are 1,000 questions we didn't have a chance to answer. So, Freddie, thank you very much. Freddie Silva,
Thank you,
everybody.
gentlemen.
Very good.
Thank you.
Renaissance man. Okay, so many thanks to our producer, Steve Bianchi. And we'll see you next Monday, November 28th, when we will welcome back the great Murray Silver, Hollywood insider, Washington insider, and renowned paranormal expert from the Savannah, Georgia area, certainly one of our most popular guests. Anything can happen when Murray is with us.
All right, so don't forget, we have all of our podcasts, show schedules, and guest information on our website, www.behindtheparanormal.com. And on our regular CBS edition, on November 27th, we'll have a paranormal tour of Scotland with author Jeff Holder. And that will be live at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 Pacific on CBS New Sky Radio in Boston, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Seattle, and online at www.newskyradio.com.
And again, just as Ben said, don't forget BehindTheParanormal.com. Almost 300 websites. No,
You have
300
300 websites.
Yes, and we're coming up on show number 300. Not all of them were numbered, so the early ones put it well over 300, but we're planning a very special show for our 300th anniversary, so to speak. And that'll be on CBS New Sky, so stay tuned for information on that. We'll leave you this evening with a thought from that really bizarre Irish author and strange thinker, stranger than us, Oscar Wilde. Quote, "It is a very sad thing that nowadays there is so much..." Let me start that again. "It is a very sad thing that nowadays there is so little useless information." Unquote.
Thanks for joining us on our great cosmic journey, and we will see you next time.
Return to this radio frequency 167 hours from now for another edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.